We're going to be looking at three different approaches to the right hand. The floating thumb approach, the resting thumb approach, and then the thumb into the fifth string on every stroke, or the thumb into an A string on every stroke approach. But before we do this, let me just quickly go over some observations I've had concerning right hand technique in general. To begin with, there's going to be a lot of arguments as to what finger of the right hand is the most efficient to use, the index finger or the middle finger. With the index finger, you might see something like this. Middle finger. I feel pretty comfortable using either my middle or the index finger. What I would recommend for most people is to experiment around with both fingers of the right hand and find out which works best for them. There are even a few of us who have a tendency to play with both fingers within the context of the same song. When I do this, I have a tendency to use my middle finger on the first string and my index finger on the second, third, and fourth string when I'm playing. So you'll see me with the index finger. And then when I'm on the first string, using the middle finger. Okay, we're going to start off by looking at the floating thumb technique. But before I do, I'd like to point out that in my own playing, I tend to use all three techniques, including the thumb in on every stroke technique, which you will hear me discouraging beginners to do a little bit later on in this video. Once you have mastered the techniques and are very comfortable, then it's a good idea to explore all three of them and, as I mentioned before, incorporate them into your own playing. Just don't let the thumb in on every stroke technique become so ingrained that you can't break out of it and go into the other approaches as well. For me, the floating technique is my main approach. I will let my thumb occasionally rest against my index finger for the resting approach. And especially when I've got a series of single note brushes happening, I will go into the thumb in on every stroke approach as well. Here's the floating approach. In this approach, what you're trying to do is keep your hand as relaxed as possible. So if you take your hand and put it into the basic claw position, and then just relax your thumb completely, you'll find that your thumb has a tendency to remain fairly close to the index finger. Now, you take that hand with the index or middle finger of the right hand, it doesn't matter which. Middle finger would look like this. You let it come in to a string, brush across the strings, letting your thumb catch the fifth string on the downstroke, bearing the weight of the thumb, and then as you release the hand, just let your hand come back out into that very relaxed floating position. With the index finger, it'll look like this. A very comfortable way to play. Very relaxed. And absolutely no tension in the right hand whatsoever. Okay, I'd like to now look at the second approach, which is something that I would classify as the resting thumb approach. In this approach, and it applies mostly to index finger players, what you will be doing is actually letting the thumb come to rest very lightly against the index finger as you come in for the bump strokes. So you can see my thumb is resting just lightly against that finger. I come in, hit the bump stroke, and then as I come in for the brush stroke, my thumb comes in, catches itself on the fifth string. You notice that my thumb is bearing the weight of the right hand, which is something that should always happen when you are playing any brush strokes. And then as my hand moves away, the thumb will sound off. At that point, as the thumb moves away, it's very easy to let the index finger come up and just sort of pick that thumb up again, and you're ready to go in for the next stroke. The only difference between this particular pattern and the floating pattern is with the floating pattern, your thumb might be this far away from your index finger. And in the resting, it's right there. Very little difference in distance, because this is where your thumb wants to be at rest. This is where it's going to be when you float, which is very close to the index finger. And when you're resting, it's going to be actually making contact with that index finger. Make sure that if you use the resting approach, that you do not grip the index finger. At that point, you will be bracing your thumb against that in order to get a stronger sound out of your index finger. And this can actually be very detrimental. You do not want to do anything that introduces tension, and this will introduce tension. You want the thumb to just barely be touching that index finger and be very relaxed if you play this particular style. And that is the resting thumb approach. Okay, we're going to take a look at the thumb on every stroke technique. I'm going to use my middle finger for reasons that I'll explain just a little bit later on during this demonstration. But the idea here is to train your thumb to come into the strings on every single stroke. Every time the hand moves into the strings, the thumb will also come into the strings. And it'll look something like this if I was applying it to the basic strum. This technique does not present as much of a problem for those of you who play with your middle finger. For those of you who play with your index finger, it presents a much greater problem. When you're playing the middle finger, your thumb will probably exist about this far away from your middle finger most of the time. It'll come in, of course, a little bit closer for drop thumbing, and then drop out farther for the fifth string. Both those positions you can get to fairly well without introducing tension in the right hand. For those of you who are using your index finger, then the thumb has to be held out quite a bit farther, and at that point you have a real problem because you are now introducing a lot of tension in the thumb just to keep it far enough away from the index finger. As you're playing the basic strum pattern. Another problem that occurs, and again, especially for those who are using the index finger, because you're keeping the thumb tense, there's a real tendency to want to let the thumb come into the fifth string, even when your mind is telling you that you actually want to play a drop thumb. You may find that you've worked up the neck or up the strings, and then at one point you want to come into a drop thumb and find your thumb on its own, because of habit, has cocked itself on that fifth string when you really were thinking that you wanted to come in and play more of a drop thumb type pattern.